So this general session, which will be inside, we'll be taking a closer look at how hybrids flex when we're talking about corn. This is something that farmers maybe have a little trouble understanding. Some growers, as you talk to them, they talk about how they had a low population in the field, but the hybrid flexed up and made up the difference. One thing we know about hybrids and how they flex is the only way they can flex is down. They don't flex up in size, they flex down. If you had a corn plant on a headland all by itself with no other plants around it, let's say they got drove over or whatever, that single plant intercepting so much sunlight would attempt to put on multiple ears and maybe even suckers. If you took the suckers away and didn't let it multiple ear, you'd get one ear that would be the maximum genetically possible probably for that particular hybrid. And there's a pretty good chance that that hybrid would produce more starch than it could get in one ear. Once we start to crowd plants and we push the rows together and the population's up, then the amount of starch in each ear starts to go down and the hybrid starts to flex down to accommodate that. And we're going to talk about that because that's going to be an important part of understanding how a hybrid responds to certain situations out there. Now, we want to make sure that we're producing enough kernels to hold the starch produced per acre out there. So you're going to produce so much starch through photosynthesis, and that starch needs to be stored in the ear, and we want to make sure that we have enough space in the ear to hold all starch produced. So we talk about that, we go out and say, what's the ideal population in the field? You're always looking for a little tip pullback, some kernels on the end of that ear that didn't get filled, meaning you had more kernels, but you just didn't have the starch to fill them. Now, how hybrids flex is different between hybrids out there in the field when they do that flexing. So let's think of that as this balloon. The air inside this balloon represents starch produced in the field, and we got to be able to store the starch in this balloon. Now we want to know the balloon has enough room, or the ear has enough room to hold that starch, and that's what we call that tip pullback. So you have a little bit of tip pullback, knowing that kernel count wasn't your limiting factor, or ear count was your limiting factor. Now as we go through the season, if we have a tough spring, some hybrids will flex their girth down. So they will reduce their girth maybe from 20 around to 18. And when they reduce their girth, that means the starch produced has to be put in the rest of that ear. So while reducing their girth, you may increase the odds that they would have longer ears or deeper depth of kernel. If there's some type of stress later in the season that restricts length, so we push the length down in that ear, then the only thing we're doing is forcing the ear to push that starch into kernel depth. And that's going to be what we're going to be teaching: kernel girth, length, and depth. When does your hybrid flex? Does it flex early in the season? So we can have two hybrids that produce a 30 long ear, but one might be 30 long and the kernels are full right to the tip of the ear. There is no extra kernels. While the hybrid next to it might be 45 long, aborted back to 30. So there's big differences of are they flexing before pollination or are they flexing after pollination? We're going to focus in this session on how to know what your hybrids are doing, how to learn that, because it becomes key in managing it. For those hybrids that flex early stress has become an issue. So by putting this all together, then we start to understand how hybrids respond to things like planting date, starter fertilizer, when we do our side dressing, late side dressing, fungicide applications. Because for instance, if your hybrid gets all of its horsepower in flexing and depth of kernel, how much starch it puts in the kernel, well, depth of kernel comes the last 30 days of the last 60 days of that plant's life. So stay green and not running out of nitrogen at the back end of the season, they're crucial for those genetics that get most of their horsepower out of depth. And we manage them different than we would a hybrid that has all of its kernels set, taken care of already by pollination, and you can't change it by keeping it greener longer in the season itself. So we'll focus on how to figure this out within your hybrid and then how to implement that into your management regime for the whole season.